whatever your listeners might have heard about the Lobito Corridor, it's almost certainly wrong. Of all the things that we've studied in our 20-year careers, this is the one where it was hardest to work out even what the project was. And ultimately we came to the conclusion that this was deliberate, that the United States in particular was creating a kind of massive propaganda effort, which unfortunately think tankers, media and so on were falling for.
Hello, my name is Poorva Karkare. I am Senior Policy Analyst at ECDPM, and I'll be your host today. In today's world of constant geopolitically shifting sands, things have become quite tricky for everyone, but especially for developing countries, and those in Africa particularly. On the one hand, you have the West trying to distinguish themselves from quote-unquote predators. So you could include China in here, Russia, or anyone else. They're trying to do this as they are engaging with third countries. Let's take the example of Africa in this case. So you have this dynamic unfolding on the one hand, and then on the other hand, African countries really trying to stay the course to develop their own economies and not get into this pickle of choosing geopolitical camps. The Lobito Corridor is really an example that has captured the imagination of many policymakers and observers alike. And so exactly to talk about what is myth, what is reality in the Lobito Corridor, and how African countries actually exercise their agency in order to get what is best for their own countries, I am joined by two phenomenal guests today. We have Lee Jones, who is Professor of International Political Economy and International Relations at Queen Mary, University of London, and Shahar Hameiri, who is Professor of International Politics at University of Queensland, Australia. So they have written a very interesting paper on the Lobito Corridor, which is currently being reviewed. So it's not out yet. And I really do hope that you find this conversation interesting. Lee, Shahar, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So, Lee, if I could maybe start with you, what got you interested in the Lobito Corridor in the first place?
Well, we've done lots of work on China and particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, China's approach to development financing, but particularly our work has been focused on Asia or the global picture. But through that, we got interested in what you were talking about right at the start, Western efforts to compete with China and distinguish themselves from China, including the decision to try to compete with China on the provision of infrastructure in the global south. And through that, we got interested more generally in what is sometimes called the Second Cold War or the new Cold War between the West and China. And the Lobito Corridor is the self-declared flagship project of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, which is this US and EU-led attempt to mobilize private financing to compete with China in the global south over infrastructure.
We see, for instance, Biden's Secretary of State Blinken calling it genuinely transformative. We've seen Biden himself saying that the United States was building this railway from coast to coast in Africa. I'm paraphrasing there. And we've seen, for instance, reports, probably the one that really comes to mind in the Wall Street Journal, saying this is essentially the US derailing, this was their pun, I'm sorry about it, derailing China's influence in Africa. So obviously, this didn't jive very well with our finding from a bigger paper, which looked at US effort to compete with China, which has found that the US was largely ineffective in its efforts to compete with China. And this was because the model involved trying to attract private investors to invest in infrastructure project in the global south. And because these investors were not interested, largely there was very little building of infrastructure actually happening. And that model actually applies also to the European Union. But given what we heard about the Lobito Corridor in the media, we thought that it's, I think, very important to test this particular project because it is quite conceivable that even though levels of mobilization overall are not very high, the United States and its officials are capable of finding particular projects that can meaningfully advance US geopolitical, geoeconomic goals. And the Lobito Corridor seemed like the best example for that out there. Now, what made it especially interesting is the fact that critical minerals was a very important aspect of that as well. And we know that in recent years that has become a major agenda for the US government and also for Europe. So it looked as though if American and to a lesser extent European involvement is going to work anywhere, it is going to work in this particular project. And that's what brought us to Angola and to look at this project.
Right.
Perhaps I could just say something about what the EU is doing specifically, because this is obviously a Europe podcast. So the headline figures that your listeners might have heard about is, in the US case, the figure of $4 billion of investment is thrown around in the Lobito Corridor. The figure that the EU itself is now throwing around is 2 billion euros. Now, I think that is, in both cases, it's total nonsense. You only get to those figures by vastly inflating everything, collating everything you've ever done in the country over decades, and even including stuff that's not even in the corridor countries. It is just a massive disinformation campaign by the US. The US is particularly bad at it, but the EU is now getting into the game as well. But the interesting thing is that despite all that, I think it's still true that the EU is actually doing more than the US. Because both of them are doing so little. So notionally, the earlier figures before this 2 billion figure started to be floated, what our fieldwork in Angola, talking to the Europeans there, suggested was that there was about 600 to 700 million euros sitting in bilateral and regional envelopes. So that was the sort of total commitment to the entire region. And it wasn't specifically devoted to the Lobito Corridor, and there was no extra money being devoted to it. So at the most, you're talking about the rebadging or redirection of multi-year programs across several different countries. The Europeans like to say that they're taking a Team Europe approach to the Lobito Corridor after they signed on with the US as the co-leaders of this project in late 2023. So, and that covers a range of different activities. Notionally, the Italians are leading on core rail investment. So when they were G7 president in 2024, they pledged at least 320 million euros of grant equity and debt capital for this proposed Zambia leg of the railway. But we couldn't actually confirm that they had made this commitment beyond a few media reports. And as we might talk about later on, the Zambia leg almost certainly isn't going to happen anyway. The Germans are leading on some energy projects. I think that's mostly some small scale solar. The Dutch are leading on an avocados project. We might come back to that later on. There's some money from the Swiss and the Czechs around critical minerals governance. And then France is doing some technical and vocational education and training. But all of this is really quite small beer. So when you actually get below the headline figures which seek to inflate and exaggerate EU funding, the total figure, even if you put all these things together, is probably less than 112 million euros across all three corridor countries. So in the end, it's pretty small beer, and it's spread out quite widely, including in areas that, when you start to understand what's actually happening on the ground, aren't really part of the active Lobito Corridor. And what we tended to find in general was European officials privately are quite skeptical of what the US says it's doing. And the whole idea behind the project makes relatively little sense to them. The idea of, building this railway into the Congo to extract critical minerals on the basis that this will somehow ensure that a Western-facing route out of the copper belt will funnel copper and other critical minerals to the West. Lots of EU officials simply said, that doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to think that that's actually true. And I think, their hearts are in the right place, in that their sense is we should focus on the wider economic benefits that could arise to these partner countries to make it less extractive, to try and foster wider development. But they're still not putting their money where their mouth is. At the same time, they are at least doing something, whereas compared to the amount of hype that there is in the media and think tank community around the Lobito Corridor, the US is doing very little. As we might come on to later, the main thing it's supposed to be doing, which is supporting actually a European firm consortium to run a railway from the port of Lobito in Angola through to the copper mines in Congo. That loan, $550 million loan, has still not been disbursed to that consortium. And the amount of other support for kind of wider economic diversification or spillover projects is hardly anything. You're talking about under $10 million. So even though Europe is not actually doing that much, it's still doing more than the US.
Something, yeah. I mean, just to add on to that, I really do think, especially if you're talking about critical minerals, much of it hinges also on the assumptions that you are making in terms of not just supply side dynamics, but also the demand side of things. Because in the EU, in another report that we just finalized, one of the things that we find out that the EU imports CRM related products, but these are intermediary products. These are industrial goods which are used in their value chains, which are much further downstream than what African countries are exporting at this point in time. So you can't simply assume that you can just take those minerals, bring them into Europe or US and refine them. But also, another point that you hinted at, which I think is worth highlighting, is the very big difference between announcements and commitments and disbursals. And that is exactly what makes the Lobito Corridor full of smoke and mirrors, right? Because there are all these numbers that are thrown at you, but then in terms of actual dispersal, it's quite a different story. For the EU, it is true. And we also need to make not so much a distinction, but an addition of things. Because if you look at the activities that Brussels is directing, or the Commission is actually looking at, it's in the traditional trade facilitation role that the EU has very prominently played in Africa. They're still trying to figure out how to do this more geopolitically. And this will take time, right? Because you also have the multi-annual financial framework, which kind of gives you an outline of where the budget can be allocated, etc. But you do have member states who have a bit more flexibility in terms of how they are doing things. That's why you also gave us a list of where different member states are also focusing. But overall, yes, the Global Gateway Initiative, as it stands right now, is also about repackaging of what they already were planning on doing or have been doing for a very long time. So you could ask questions around additionality, but it's still something. But maybe building on that point, Lee, coming back to you again. In the paper, I see that you are also quite critical of the PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, in sort of meeting its lofty ambitions. And of course, you do that with the case of the Lobito Corridor. I mean, you gave us an idea very well in terms of the EU, but could you explain to our listeners in what ways these ambitions actually fall short, or what the PGII is trying to achieve falls short of what they have stated their ambitions as?
So to think about PGII in its sort of general macro sense, the objective when it was launched was to mobilize $600 billion in 5 years. Now, if we look at the total mobilization of private finance by all multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, the amount directly mobilized, the figures that we've got, which are from 2019 to 2023, the total directly mobilized is less than $55 billion.
Oh, wow.
So that's the sort of macro picture. They can also claim to have indirectly mobilized $262 billion, but this is where causation starts to break down. That your point about additionality there is absolutely crucial. So what they're trying to do under the billions to trillions platform that has guided the MDBs and so on since 2015 is you use small amounts of grant money to de-risk investments and to escort private capital into projects that they wouldn't otherwise have gone into. That's what additionality means. So we are kind of catalyzing that investment. You can measure that directly. So you can say, okay, we know that that grant money, without that grant money, those private investors wouldn't have gone in. That's direct mobilization. Indirect mobilization is where you can't really prove that there is any additionality. And the methods for assessing that are really dodgy, and it's basically they're marking their own homework. So they've got every incentive to inflate it to make it look like they're much more successful than they are. But even if you were to put those things together, basically they haven't mobilized much more than half of what they said they were going to do. And even that's inflated. So that's the macro level picture. And that's why we were skeptical of these claims that were being made of the Lobito Corridor, because it flew in the face of the general macro level picture that we've established in our published work already. And so we wanted to go and find out what was actually happening. And I would say that of all the things that we've studied in our 20-year careers, this is the one where it was hardest to work out even what the project was. What was the geographical extent of this project? Who was actually doing what? What were the commitments? Because there was so much, as you say, smoke and mirrors around this. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that this was deliberate, that the United States in particular was creating a kind of massive propaganda effort, which unfortunately think tankers, media and so on were falling for. And so there was a lot of disinformation to cut through. And then Angola is an extremely expensive country to do field work in. And luckily, Shahar had a grant funded by the Australian Research Council that allowed us to go. We did field work at multiple sites, both ends of the railway and in Washington, DC. And so we could finally understand what was actually going on. And I would say that there are three kind of big myths that have been propagated about the corridor, such that if whatever your listeners might have heard about the Lobito Corridor, it's almost certainly wrong. So I'll just go through those three. So the first is that, as Shahar said earlier on, Biden claimed the United States was building a trans-African railway from the port of Lobito in Angola to outwards towards Dar es Salaam. And this was going to be the first trans-African railway. The truth is that the United States is supporting in a very limited way the rehabilitation of a colonial-era Chinese-refurbished railway in Angola. And the inception behind this project is very much Angolan itself, right? It's Angola that wanted this project and wants the spillover effects. And this has been a long-standing Angolan government wish. It wasn't created by the United States. This railway was built under colonialism, as I said, and it extended into the Belgian Congo as it then was. And the bit that goes that connects into the Congo is not covered by American support. And that line has not been rehabilitated by the Chinese, and so it remains dilapidated. There was a part of the idea was to extend the railway also into Zambia with a spur line. This is a long-standing desire by the Zambian government. But EU-funded feasibility study has shown that would cost $4 to $5 billion, not the $1 billion that was originally thought. And so that almost certainly won't get built. The idea of connecting bits of the Congo's railway lines through to Tanzania via the Tazara Railway, which was also built by the Chinese in the 1970s, that's purely notional. Nobody at all is working on that part. And subsequent to the inception of this corridor, a Chinese firm has won the concession to operate on and upgrade the Tazara Railway, which makes a link up almost certainly to be impossible. So the reality is that it's really just this railway between Lobito and Kolwezi in the DRC that is the focus of the corridor in reality. And the DRC part is still pretty much a shambles. The second myth is that by supporting this railway, the Western powers are funneling DRC critical minerals to the West. The reality is that the vast majority of the Congo's copper continues to be trucked, not taken by railway, to other ports in Africa, because while this railway was dilapidated during the Angolan Civil War, a gigantic trucking industry established itself in the DRC, which is now very politically powerful. And the miners prefer these trucking routes. And about 60% of Congo's copper goes to China. And many Chinese firms operate in the Congolese mining sector and refiners too. The really funny thing, though, is that of the amount of copper that is transiting the Lobito Corridor, which is increasing from a very low base, an estimated 80 to 95% of that also goes to China. The consortium which operates on the railway, which is called the Lobito Atlantic Railway Consortium, or LAR, their only major offtake deal is with a mine that is 45% owned by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And even the consortium itself, which is a consortium of Trafigura, Motor NGL, and a small Belgian NGO called Vecturis, even the consortium itself is partly Chinese owned, because China Communications Construction Company has a stake in Motor NGL. So if you look at it on the whole, it's about 11% Chinese owned. So China is benefiting from the railway. It's not going to funnel all this copper to the West. And then the third myth is that this is so much better than what China offers, because it's clean, it's not corrupt, it's not predatory, it's not extractive, it's ensuring wider spillover benefits. So firstly, on the kind of corruption side, Motor NGL and Trafigura have been seriously mired in allegations of corrupt practices. They were very much tied to the old Dos Santos government in Angola, which was deeply corrupt. And the American government was even prosecuting Trafigura for similar offences in places like Mexico and Brazil. So, you know, it's not a case of squeaky clean West against, you know, evil, corrupt China. And then the wider developmental benefits that are supposed to spill over from rehabilitating and supporting this railway are really failing to manifest, which is really a function of the problems, local problems, the problems that the US and EU have mobilizing their own private sector to invest in developing countries, but also the lack of a serious private sector inside Angola. And as I said, the EU is most focused on this attempt to try to get wider economic growth and diversification going, but they're also not really mobilizing the funds necessary to make it happen.
Right. This is very useful. I mean, of the 3 points you make, the one sort of red thread flowing through all of them is that we need to take into account the wishes or priorities of partner countries, take into account domestic politics, as you were talking about the trucking business in the DRC, and also the fact that, you know, exercising agency does not always have to mean a positive sum game all the time, because exercise can also be agency can also be exercised in a way that actually benefits you personally, but not necessarily the greater good. So maybe with that in mind, Shahar, what I would like to ask you is, you do talk about the relevance of agency of these corridor countries. Can you explain a bit how that is reflected in the paper?
Yes, so a lot of the time when people talk about geoeconomics or geopolitics, there is an assumption there that once, say, the US government decides to, for instance, compete with China, all it has to do is just make that decision and then mobilize resources, and it's all seen as very unproblematically functioning, you know, to at the very least move the United States in the direction that it wishes to go. And we're making a point in the paper that actually, in order to understand the limits both internally and externally in what the United States is trying to do, what you have to understand is the legacy of decades of economic globalization that have had impacts both within the United States and in Europe, of course, but also in the places where the United States wishes to intervene. So we've had 40 years or so of deepening economic integration around the world that mean that it has many, many different implications for our story. But let's just begin by saying that a lot of the resources that US policymakers need in order to make things happen are not actually controlled directly or indirectly by US companies, because the United States has deindustrialized internally. A lot of US firms have shifted certain operations offshore. A lot of manufacturing now occurs in China and other parts of the world, but not within the United States. A lot of the expertise that they need in order to do things, for instance, in the infrastructure domain, are just not available within the United States because the United States' own infrastructure has been run down over that period so badly. There is a report that we looked at by the American Association of Civil Engineers that basically points out that it would take several trillions of dollars just to bring the United States' own infrastructure domestically into a state of good repair, not even advance it in any significant way, just bring it to a state of good repair. There's so many problems internally. And then the United States wants to go out in the world and essentially build infrastructure, but it doesn't have the firms, the know-how, even the interest from its own domestic business sector in carrying out these kinds of operations. The European story is somewhat similar as well, but perhaps not quite as rundown as what is happening within the United States. So that's the legacy on infrastructure, but it also carries over to critical minerals because the United States, for instance, has very little demand for a lot of the critical minerals, both the rare earth, but also other critical minerals. We mentioned copper before. Well, half the copper in the world is going to China. And as Lee said before, 60% of the copper from DRC. So when US policymakers want to get firms to basically fall in line with what they would like to do, what they find is when these firms are operating in sectors that are dominated by Chinese firms, it's not very much in those companies' interests to exclude China, because they would be excluding a very, very large market. And in some cases, they would also be excluding very important inputs and know-how that they would need just to be able to carry out their business. So that is a fundamental problem that is constraining what the United States can do, if you like, internally. But then there's the issue that you raised, which is basically the political economy of the environments in which the United States wishes to operate. Angola being the main case here, but also DRC and Zambia. So we have another project working with colleagues on this term that we've developed called polyalignment. Now, what that means is that the way in which most countries around the world, call them middle ground countries, if you will, are interacting now with the United States and China, pretty much with everybody else, is that they are overall heavily incentivized not to choose sides in this second Cold War, as Lee called it, new Cold War. Why? Because, again, after 40 years of globalization, most of them are already very, very closely integrated to all sides in this geopolitical rivalry. But also, even if they're not already, they are incentivized to at least build out and maintain these connections, because choosing one side, excluding the other, is absolutely not feasible in many cases, because neither side actually offers everything that they need in order to advance their own development. Often the offers that are coming from either side are actually quite meager. So they are strongly incentivized to choose both sides. Sometimes the local political economy context actually works in the interests of the United States. And that's, if you like, what happened in the case of Angola, because, as Lee previously said, Angola has suffered from a very deep economic crisis for quite a long time now. It's very oil dependent. It's been looking to diversify its economy. It's also been looking for quite a long time to capitalize a little bit more on its significant investment in infrastructure that were made, especially by recruiting Chinese firms to rebuild the railway and the port and a number of other major infrastructure projects. And the government there thought, already in the late 2010s that the returns were not there, and were looking to get private firms to come in and run them better. Now, in that situation, that provided an opening for this Western consortium backed by the US, although, again, the loan is not being dispersed, to be able to come in and win the concession. But that is to do with the local political economy context. But of course, that has some limits as well, because Angola is not interested in signing up, holus bolus to the US camp or the Western camp or whatever that even means anymore. It wishes to keep its options open with China as well. And we have seen a number of instances lately of, for instance, Sonangol, the Angolan state-owned oil company, reaching out to obtain financing for an oil refinery from China. So it's not as though geopolitically Angola has somehow switch fully to the Western camp.
Right. Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I also just want to add that we ourselves also wrote a paper about the Lobito Corridor last year, where we also highlighted some of these dynamics. So I will also make it a point to add a link to that paper in the show notes.
That's a brilliant paper.
It's a great paper. It inspired our work.
Thanks a lot. But I mean, linked to what you are saying, precisely that decoupling is, if not impossible, very difficult for these countries. So they very much prefer to work with all partners because they bring their own unique advantages and disadvantages that you have to then try to work around. Um, but in the case of Angola, maybe it worked a bit too nicely. And I think in the recent past, if you look at what has been unfolding in the DRC vis-a-vis Zambia when it comes to critical minerals, you see this tension perhaps a lot more clearly, where you have with the DRC now this new deal with the US, security for minerals kind of deal, as a sort of short form of it. Whereas in Zambia, you see some kind of falling out because of the stance that their president took vis-a-vis how this was being framed when it came to providing funding for health, for instance. Could you maybe also reflect that a bit?
Yeah, just briefly, again, that goes back to the point I was making before about polyalignment. So everyone wants to polyalign, but the local context matters quite a bit. So, for instance, DRC has been fighting this long-running civil war against the Rwanda-backed rebels, and it is seeking some security support from the United States. So that maybe provided the United States with a little bit more leverage that it could use to sign this minerals deal and open up some opportunities for US firms within the DRC. But of course, the DRC, most of its mining operations, refining facilities and so on are still owned by Chinese firms. And there is absolutely no way that the United States would prevent that from happening. They're not going to get all these Chinese firms to divest out of DRC, and they're not going to get the DRC government to agree to it either. And when it comes to the Lobito Corridor specifically, Lee mentioned previously the powerful trucking industries that have emerged, the interests that are behind these interests are very powerful within the DRC. And we have heard from contacts on the ground that is one of the main reasons why the upgrades to the railway are not really happening or not happening very fast on the DRC side, because why would they accept these developments? So DRC, when it sort of comes to the Lobito Corridor, its leaders are happy to, have their photos taken and be seen to be participating in this project, but it doesn't mean that they've bought into it in any significant way. When we came, I mean, I'm preempting this because I haven't spoken about Zambia, but when we went to Lobito to visit the offices of the new tripartite agency that was formed and was signed between the three countries to facilitate the Lobito Corridor project, we found the building empty, and we have heard that the only country to have sent a representative is actually Angola, and the other two did not. So that's interesting, and it's quite telling, I think. Zambia is a slightly different story. I mean, Zambia doesn't have the problem of this civil war that it's fighting. So it's maybe more classically polyaligned. And again, there are very significant Chinese mining interests within Zambia. It's a major market for Zambian copper and is going to remain a major market for Zambian copper for some time. The president of Zambia, Chilema, basically said, look, we're not signing up to either side. He said that quite explicitly. But of course, the United States tried to force his hand and did it in a fairly insulting fashion, really. It tried to leverage a much reduced amount of aid in order to get a special deal for some US firms within the Zambian mining sector, and Zambia was in a position not to accept that. But, if the United States came back at some later time and offered a better deal, I'm quite certain that Zambia would want it. But at the same time, they would not want to exclude China from Zambia. So that's what everyone is doing. But of course, the local complexion does shape exactly what form it takes.
Right. No, that's a fair point. I mean, just on the Lobito Corridor, the Transit Transport Facilitation Agency, it was only recently established with a rotating, the three countries kind of rotating the leadership of it. So right now it's Angola, but I think it might, we hope, we don't know yet, but we would hope that because it's in a stage of just getting started, you might see more participation from Angola, precisely because it is based headquartered also in Angola at the moment.
It is pretty clear, though. I take your point, but it's pretty clear that Angola, of the three countries, is the one that is most committed to advancing the Lobito corridor, and especially to increasing traffic along the railway and using it as a way of diversifying its economy.
Exactly, because it has that railway already, right? And precisely your point about diversifying also its economy. That urgency you see also when I was doing interviews in Angola, you could really see in every interview this was pointed out. Maybe we are running a bit short of time, but Lee, to come back to you with a final sort of question. Um, if we were to look at the broader picture now, so not just geopolitically, but also economically, about Angola trying to diversify its economy, to what extent do you think these priorities of partner countries are also being taken into account if you're talking about agriculture?
Not very much, I have to say. The position of Angola is a strange one in that although it is home to the vast majority of the railway, it doesn't really benefit from the railway. During the colonial period, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that Angola was actually wealthier during the colonial period than mainland Portugal itself. And that was because of the enormous development of plantations and industry along the railway. And the Angolans, as you probably found yourself, are very nostalgic for that period. The reason why they brought the Chinese in and were willing to take out loans for this purpose to rehabilitate the railway in the 2000s was that they want that back. And you might argue, well, it's a bit naive to think that you can recreate a colonial era economy in a period of globalization, but that is their aspiration. So because they don't benefit from the mining offtake, which comes from the DRC, they get tiny, tiny transit fees. They get a little bit of money from the concession because the LAR had to pay some money up front, and they agreed to do some additional rehabilitation, and they agreed to do some employment and training. But that's small beer. The Angolans' interest is in fostering wider economic development and especially diversification alongside the railway, which stems from the collapse in oil prices in the late 2010s and the devastating impact that had on Angola's political economy, which was completely hinged around oil exports and imports for everything else. So that is their objective for the Lobito Corridor. Now, when we were interested in what was going on with infrastructure, but we also explored this economic diversification piece, and we kept asking the dozens of people we talked to, what is going on? You know, what are the areas where this is actually happening? And people repeatedly cited the same two examples, and there were only two. And when you asked them, okay, there's those two, what's the third, what's the fourth, what's the fifth? They basically couldn't come up with anything. So there's basically two projects. One is there's a big agri-food business called Carino, which is headquartered in Lobito, and they are a domestic food manufacturer, and historically they've used imported inputs to produce the food and then distribute it locally. What they want to do in the context of the oil collapse is to substitute for these imports by building out a network of domestic smallholders that can supply their business. That's their plan, and they're seeking American financing and financing from the French and some others to make this happen. So far, our latest information is that no financing has materialized, and the only support that they have had is in the past. A few years ago, there was a USAID project, $5.5 million to support this kind of link between smallholders and Carino. And the difficulty is also, even if the financing materializes for Carino, it's a very unique firm in the Angolan context. There's lots of talk that the president is a shareholder, and this is why it gets all these kind of sweetheart contracts with the military and so on. But even if that's not true, the the private sector in Angola is tiny, and there are very few firms, really none, that can do the kind of sort of flying swans model that Carino is interested in doing. So it's just not scalable. The second project is the one that's EU backed, or more specifically backed by the Netherlands, which is a project to grow avocados around a place called Kala and export those to the EU. Now, this unusually does have private sector backing because the Netherlands is the center of the trade in avocados, and the wholesalers in the Netherlands are very worried about the impact of climate change on their traditional market supplies, and so they're looking to diversify. And so the Dutch were approached first by the Angolans in 2017, and the Dutch launched this project to essentially train smallholders. They have to switch from one type of avocado to another, and they have to meet EU phytosanitary standards. They have to do all the online customs stuff. There's a lot of training to be done. And then the idea is that their inputs are all collated at a new logistics platform linked to the railway through a new spur line, which is also used by a rare earths mine, which is operated by a UK firm. And this has gone fairly well. The first shipment of avocados arrived in the Netherlands in January 2026. And as I say, about of this project, slightly less than half was funded by the private sector. The rest was funded by the World Bank and the Netherlands Development Finance Institution. But we're talking about a project that's less than 60 million euros. It's very small scale. It only covers 180 acres. And it took 8 years from inception to proof of concept with this first experimental shipment. So this is not going to set the Angolan economy on fire. There's no kind of private sector interest in doing this kind of project. So it's going to have to rely on donors to do all the hard work of stitching all this together. And I want to give credit to what the Netherlands are doing. It is a labor of love, and they're taking the right approach by thinking of it as this kind of ecosystem that they've basically got to build from scratch. But it's a huge amount of work. It has to be government-led, and it has to be ODA funded. And of course, we know in the current context, ODA is being slashed left, right, and center. So again, we don't feel that's a scalable model.
Yeah. I mean, this gives me a nice segue to maybe talk about also a project that ECDPM is doing right now, precisely to reinforce some of the points that you have made, and also to add a bit of, efforts where efforts are being put forth. So you mentioned about financing not materializing, at least for Carino to do other things. I think there it's also a question of finding the right instruments and tools, and also the right kind of actors around the table to actually make these deals happen. And so ECDPM, we're working on a project with AUDA NEPAD, where we're trying to bring together the constellation of sort of different worlds: food, trade, climate, and infrastructure, in order to bring about what you could call spur impactful investments. And while doing this project, which the first phase is now being concluded at the end of this month, actually, 3 kind of lessons stand out quite clearly to us. One is that, African private sector is actually much more dynamic and far more risky than is perceived here. In this particular project, we're looking at the beans value chain. And the reason we selected the beans value chain is precisely because, as you said, it's with avocados, it's very much export oriented. And then there's a question of how much of it can be used regionally because of purchasing power within the region. But if you look at beans, or a sector like that, where you have actually massive amounts of trade, although it's informal, it does provide some kind of opportunity to actually get a regional value chain going. So that's why we selected the beans value chain, even though we agree that it's not as sexy as, competing with China when it comes to critical minerals. But so anyway, so that's one point, that, the private sector is far more dynamic. You have Carino there as well, because Carino does produce beans. But then you have different kinds of firms, ones that are specialized in seed and other input production, others like Carino, who are much more about actual production of beans themselves, yet others that look more at packaging, who can then also comply with regional standards that you have in SADC, the Southern African Development Community. So there is a scope to work with different kinds of firms. A second point that stood out is what is lacking for these firms oftentimes is, you mentioned the word before, some kind of ecosystem. And this project that we're trying to do tries to fill in some of those gaps, either by way of policy reforms that we suggest, or also trying to bring together EU financiers where on paper there is an interest to actually make investments, but they don't know about commercially viable projects, and connecting them with African firms who have interesting ideas but always lack funding. So actually try and connect them, but with the backing, political sort of backing also of member states, because you do need that to get these actors also around the table. And in this particular case, it's been Italy, but then there can also be others as the project goes into its next phases. And then a third point that stood out, which I also made above, is that in terms of who does what, it's also quite interesting because we do see that the EU itself is very much focused, at this point in time at least, on trade facilitation and things around that, because that's where their comparative advantage also is, whether it comes to one stop border posts or other trade facilitation measures. Whereas at the member state level will be where you have interest in private sector activity. So, like whether it's about seed production, providing that a Dutch firm might be interested in providing improved varieties of seeds to the Angolan or the Zambian or the Congolese side, etc. But you also have EU technical assistance being used and private equity funders being brought together. All of that is being done in a highly technocratic, dry, typical EU Brussels style. And it's at a much, much smaller scale. But I do think these things are coming about. And the reason I wanted to highlight this particular project is simply to say that maybe you do need more projects like this that can actually help to shepherd all these different interests and channel them a bit more constructively to try and bring about some investments. But I think that's all we have time for today. So, Lee and Shahar, thank you so very much for sharing your insights with us. And thanks also to our listeners. I will see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.